Raina Rison's life in LaPorte, Indiana was centered around her family, education, and her compassion for animals. In 1993, the 16-year-old sophomore lived with her parents, Ben and Karen Rison, her older sister Lori, and her younger sister Wendy. Raina attended LaPorte High School, where she was described as a good student with a strong interest in caring for animals. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, a goal connected to the compassion she showed toward animals. Outside of school, Raina was highly responsible and worked 3 jobs while continuing her studies. One of those jobs was at an animal hospital, where she walked dogs and cleaned kennels. Her work at the animal hospital reflected her dedication and her desire to pursue a future career involving animals. Before the events of the 26th of March 1993, Raina's daily life involved balancing school, employment, and her responsibilities with her family. She was known through the provided information as a student with ambitions and a clear interest in veterinary work. Her family included the people she lived with in LaPorte, Indiana, and they were part of her life before the investigation began. This section focuses on who Raina was before her disappearance, using only details about her family, education, work, and interests. It presents her background without adding information beyond the known facts provided. The account of Raina's life before the case highlights her commitment to learning and her planned future as a veterinarian, while showing the responsibilities she carried during her youth. On Friday, March 26, 1993, Raina Rison disappeared after completing a short shift at the animal hospital in LaPorte, Indiana. She was scheduled to close the facility after working from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. and she was expected to spend the evening with her ex-boyfriend, Matt Elser. The two had recently ended their relationship but were planning the date as a possible step toward getting back together. Matt arrived at the animal hospital at 6 p.m. to pick up Raina. After waiting for her to appear, he walked toward the front door and discovered that the lights were turned off and the door was closed. He noticed that Raina's car was not in the parking lot and drove to her home to see if she had returned. Raina's father, Ben, told Matt that she had not come home and that the family had not seen her since she left for work. Raina's family became increasingly concerned because it was unusual for her not to tell them where she was. Ben, Karen, Wendy, and Matt waited at the house for Raina to return, but she had still not arrived by 10:30 p.m. The family then went to the police station and reported her missing. Police received the missing person report, while Raina's family began searching for answers. They contacted acquaintances to find information about her location and distributed missing person flyers throughout the area. A public appeal was also made for anyone with information about Raina's whereabouts to come forward. The search for Raina had officially begun. Investigators began looking into Raina's disappearance and sought information that could help determine where she had gone. The family's efforts continued as they hoped someone would provide valuable information about Raina's whereabouts and help bring her home safely after the unexpected events of night. After Raina Rison was reported missing, investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Witnesses came forward and provided information about what they had seen near the animal hospital shortly before 6 p.m. They reported seeing a sedan parked outside the building and stated that 2 men were inside the vehicle with Raina. The witnesses described what appeared to be an argument involving Raina and the men. At the time, they did not intervene because they believed it was simply a disagreement between people who knew each other. Investigators questioned Matt Elser about the events of that evening. Matt maintained that he had arrived at the animal hospital to pick up Raina, waited for her, and discovered that she was not there. Police learned more about the history of Matt and Raina's relationship, including that they had recently reunited after Matt had previously wanted to take a break. Their planned date was viewed as an important moment for their relationship. Raina's parents supported Matt and told authorities that they considered him trustworthy. They also pointed out that Matt's vehicle was not the same vehicle described by witnesses who had seen the sedan outside the animal hospital. The following night, Raina's car was discovered near the animal hospital. The vehicle's hood was raised, creating the appearance that she may have experienced car trouble. However, officers found that the car started easily with Raina's keys still inside the ignition. Investigators believe the apparent breakdown may have been staged. Inside the vehicle, officers found Raina's handbag, purse, credit cards, and money. Because these items remained untouched, the evidence indicated that robbery did not appear to be the reason behind Raina's disappearance. The investigation continued as authorities worked to understand what had happened and determine why Raina's vehicle was left behind near the hospital. A man's ring discovered inside Raina Rison's glove compartment became another focus of the investigation. Matt Elser examined the ring and told investigators that it did not belong to him. Authorities determined that the ring belonged to Jason Tibbs, Raina's ex-boyfriend from 7th grade. Jason and Raina had dated for around 8 months before ending their relationship. Investigators looked into Jason's background and learned that he had a criminal history and had dropped out of school. When questioned about the ring, Jason admitted it was his. He explained that he and Raina were still friends and that he had worked on her car, suggesting that he may have accidentally left the ring behind while working on the vehicle. Jason's explanation appeared possible because locals described him as an excellent mechanic. Investigators then asked Jason where he had been on the night Raina disappeared. Jason stated that he was playing a game called fox hunting, where participants use cars and wireless radios to share locations and search for each other. His friends confirmed that they had been playing the game that evening, but no one had actually seen Jason. Raina's father also confirmed that Raina and Jason were still friends, leaving the ring as an uncertain lead. The investigation continued when a LaPorte sheriff's deputy discovered Matt's Letterman jacket. Matt had given the jacket to Raina to wear, and it represented their relationship. The jacket was found 6 or 7 miles away from where Raina's car had been discovered. It had been placed there after the initial police search, but it provided no further evidence. With no additional clues, the investigation became inactive until Raina's body was eventually discovered. Authorities continued reviewing the case, but no immediate breakthrough followed until the discovery that changed the direction of the investigation months later. On the 26th of April, 1993, approximately 1 month after Raina Rison disappeared, her body was discovered near a pond off Range Road north of LaPorte, Indiana. A fisherman and his teenage daughter were in the area when the daughter noticed what appeared to be human legs in the water. She called for her father, who moved closer and determined that it was a female body. 2 logs had been placed on top of the body. When police arrived, they identified the woman as Raina based on the clothing she was wearing when she disappeared. Although the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, investigators confirmed her identity. The discovery changed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. Authorities initially found no obvious wounds or signs of significant trauma. However, an autopsy later determined that Raina had been strangled. Following the discovery, investigators returned to Jason Tibbs and questioned him about information connected to the case. Jason provided details about Ray McCarty, who was married to Raina's older sister, Lori. Ray had previously assaulted and impregnated Raina when she was 11 years old and had been in prison for that crime. His probation had ended only 2 months before Raina disappeared. Because of Ray's history and possible motive, investigators considered him a suspect. However, they did not find physical evidence connecting Ray McCarty to Raina's death at that time. The case remained unresolved as investigators continued searching for answers. The investigation continued without a clear suspect for months. After Ray McCarty became a primary suspect, investigators continued examining his connection to Raina Rison's disappearance and death. Ray and Lori told authorities that they had not seen Raina on the day she disappeared. Ray initially stated that he had been shooting pigeons at a friend's farm, and the friend confirmed that account. However, investigators later questioned Ray again because they felt something did not seem right. During further questioning, Ray changed his story and admitted that he had seen Raina on the night she vanished. He claimed that while house hunting around 5:40 p.m., he looked out a window and saw the animal hospital. Ray said he briefly saw Raina in the parking lot and asked her if she knew where Lori was. He stated that he then left and later picked up a female hitchhiker. Ray explained that he initially withheld this information because he believed Raina did not trust him due to what he had done to her sister. With this information, Ray became the main suspect in the investigation. However, authorities did not find physical evidence connecting him to Raina's death. The case eventually went cold for almost 18 months. Investigators later examined Larry Hall after finding Raina-related items in his van. Hall claimed he had abducted and killed Raina, but investigators determined the confession was false. They also discovered that Hall was not responsible for Raina's disappearance. His location on the night of Raina's disappearance showed he was not responsible, and he was ruled out. Raina Rison's case remained unsolved until 2008 when Indiana investigators received a letter from inmate Ricky Hammonds. At the time, he decided to contact investigators after thinking about his niece and believing that someone should come forward if anything happened to her. Ricky described events he said occurred in 1993 when he was 14 years old. He stated that he was in the roof of a barn near his parents' home when he saw a car arrive. Ricky identified his sister's boyfriend, Eric Feldman, and Jason Tibbs as the people who opened the trunk of a sedan. Inside, Ricky saw a body covered by a blanket. He said he could identify the upper half of the victim, who was wearing a Letterman jacket. A few days later, When Raina's disappearance appeared in the media, Ricky recognized the victim as Raina. Investigators located Eric Feldman in South Carolina and questioned him about what he knew. Eric was visibly nervous and initially refused to speak with authorities. After investigators told him he would face no consequences if he explained exactly what happened, Eric agreed to provide information. Eric stated that he and Jason were driving when Jason wanted to convince Raina to leave Matt and return to him. According to Eric's account, Jason called Raina over to the vehicle when she left the animal hospital. Eric said Jason forced Raina into the car, and later, after she attempted to escape, Jason strangled her. He stated that they then disposed of her body. Eric's statement gave investigators a new account of Raina's final moments and changed the direction of the investigation. The new information provided investigators with details they had not previously known and reopened the search for answers in Raina's death case. In August 2013, 8-year-old Jason Tibbs was arrested and charged with Raina Rison's death 20 years after her disappearance. The arrest followed a lengthy investigation that brought new information forward about the events surrounding Raina's final moments. During the trial, the defense challenged Ricky Hammond's credibility. They argued that Ricky had been a teenager when he witnessed the events and that he waited many years before coming forward with his account. Eric Feldman was granted immunity from prosecution so he could testify during the proceedings. After a lengthy trial that concluded in December 2014, Jason Tibbs was found guilty. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 20 years served outside the courtroom. Following the verdict, Raina's family reacted emotionally. They felt they had received some form of justice, while also recognizing that the outcome could not bring Raina back. Jason continued to maintain his innocence and claimed that Ray McCarty was responsible for Raina's death. He filed multiple appeals, but the Indiana Court of Appeals rejected his request for a new trial in 2016. In 2018, his lawyers stated that they were still fighting for his innocence. Raina was 16 years old when her life ended. She had aspirations of becoming a veterinarian and had a future she was working toward. Her family continued to remember the loss of the daughter they could never bring back. The case concluded with a conviction, but Raina's family continued living with loss caused by her death and the events surrounding it. Laura Sammons was born on the 6th of October 1965 in Tennessee. By 1984, she was 18 years old and attending Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro. Alongside her studies, she worked as a cashier at a Kroger grocery store, balancing college responsibilities with regular employment as she built her future. On the 31st of May 1984, a farmer traveling home noticed clothing lying in a field. Curious about what he had seen, he approached the area and made a tragic discovery. Beneath the clothing was Laura. She was wearing only limited clothing and had been covered with 2 pairs of jeans and a dark jacket. One sleeve of the jacket had been placed around her neck area. Investigators determined that 1 pair of jeans belonged to Laura, while the second pair belonged to a man. They also found another piece of clothing held tightly in one of her hands. The examination concluded that Laura died from serious injuries to the head. Investigators believed nearby rocks had been involved, and the injuries indicated she had been hit several times. During the examination, the medical examiner also determined that Laura had been close with someone within the previous 24 to 48 hours. However, no signs or information indicated that the encounter had happened against her wishes. Among the most significant pieces of evidence were the men's jeans recovered at the location. Testing identified male DNA believed to belong to the person responsible. Despite its importance, DNA technology in 1984 was still too limited to identify the source, leaving investigators unable to pursue that evidence further at the time. Laura worked at Kroger during the day of her final known activities, and investigators later reconstructed her movements to understand what happened before her passing. Records showed that she left the store at around 1 p.m. after completing her work shift. She was expected to visit Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro to check her grades and meet with university office personnel. After that, Laura planned to go swimming at her grandmother's house, but she never arrived at either location. Investigators found Laura's car near the Kroger store, several miles away from where she was discovered. A search of the vehicle revealed no unknown fingerprints that belonged to someone other than Laura. However, investigators discovered an unfamiliar hair inside the vehicle and preserved it with the DNA material collected from the men's jeans found at the location. They also recovered dirt from the vehicle's wheel wells. The FBI laboratory determined that the dirt was highly consistent with soil from the road beside the location. This suggested that Laura's car had been driven to the area where she was found before being returned to her workplace. Investigators believe this indicated the person responsible may have known Laura. Witnesses later placed Laura at a local nightclub the evening before her passing, where she was seen dancing with an unidentified young man. Investigators theorized that Laura may have met someone there before going to a secluded Lover's Lane area used by local students for gatherings and bonfires. The unidentified man remained. Laura's high school boyfriend, David Kyle Gilley, became one of the first major persons examined by investigators. He was known to be jealous, and detectives considered whether his relationship with Laura could have played a role in what happened. However, investigators accepted an explanation provided by Gilley's stepfather, who claimed David had been home throughout the day Laura was found. Based on that information, David was ruled out. Another lead emerged when a Nashville woman reported that she had been harmed by a man named John Taylor. According to her account, Taylor threatened to repeat what he had done to Laura. Taylor denied the claim and denied having any connection to Laura's case. Investigators discovered that Taylor attended the same university as Laura, belonged to the same health club, participated in some of the same fraternity events, and had been near the university on the day of the incident. They also learned he had a history of aggressive behavior toward women. FBI analysts compared the unfamiliar hair recovered from Laura's car with Taylor's hair and reported that the samples were consistent. However, this comparison was not enough for further action because mitochondrial DNA testing was not yet available. The hair characteristics could have matched about 20% of the population. Investigators also determined that the men's jeans found at the location would not have fit Taylor's smaller build, forcing them to continue searching despite the similarities. Despite the efforts of investigators, the case remained unresolved for years, as more than 100 individuals were examined without producing answers. During this time, Laura's mother, Laureen Mackey, made a promise at her daughter's grave that she would continue seeking justice for Laura, even though she did not know how that promise would eventually be fulfilled. Dan Goodwin had a personal connection to Laura and became an important figure in the renewed investigation. Just days before Laura's death, Dan went to a movie with her. At Laura's funeral, he promised her mother that he would help find the person responsible. After working as a newspaper reporter at the Daily News Journal, Dan became a police officer and eventually was assigned Laura's cold case. One of Dan's first steps was sending the preserved evidence for modern DNA testing because forensic science had advanced greatly since 1984. While waiting for the results, he investigated other leads. In 2000, a high school student claimed that his father, David Patterson, had admitted killing a young woman in 1984 because Patterson was already deceased. Investigators obtained DNA from his children for comparison. The testing excluded Patterson as a suspect. Dan also tested John Taylor, whose DNA did not match the evidence. Dan voluntarily submitted his own DNA because of his friendship with Laura, and testing confirmed he was not involved. These eliminations allowed investigators to re-examine earlier suspects from the original investigation, eventually leading Dan back to David Gilley, Laura's former boyfriend. Investigators continued examining the evidence surrounding Gilley's possible involvement in Laura's death again. Dan Goodwin revisited David Gilley's original alibi and discovered evidence that challenged the conclusions of the initial investigation. A witness had reported seeing David driving Laura's car on the day her body was found near the road leading toward the crime scene. The witness described David's expression as blank and later identified both him and Laura's vehicle through formal identification procedures. Investigators also examined David's history of violence toward Laura. Reports showed that he had previously grabbed her by the head, slammed her against cars and school lockers, punched her, and on one occasion broke 2 of her front teeth. Dan questioned why someone with this documented behavior had been dismissed so quickly during the original investigation. Crime scene reconstruction specialist Jerry Finley then examined the men's jeans more closely. He identified tiny bloodstains as medium-velocity impact spatter located mainly above the knees. The reconstruction indicated that the wearer had been kneeling while repeatedly striking Laura with a blunt object, such as the rocks recovered nearby. DNA testing confirmed that the blood on the jeans belonged to Laura, reinforcing investigators' belief that the jeans belonged to the person responsible for her death. Dan later located David Gilley in Florida, where he worked for the Manatee County Public Works Department and had accumulated arrests for battery, attempted burglary, and resisting arrest. During questioning, David denied involvement but acknowledged that the men's jeans could probably be his. After investigators explained why they believed the jeans belonged to the perpetrator, he requested an attorney. Investigators continued reviewing the evidence surrounding Gilly as they prepared to determine whether the findings connected him to Laura's death. The renewed investigation focused on the witness statement, the jeans, and the evidence that had been overlooked during the earlier stages of the case before further action was taken. Investigators obtained a saliva sample from David Gilly on the 31st of May 2000. DNA testing confirmed that he was the source of the male DNA recovered from the men's jeans left at the crime scene. On the 16th anniversary of Laura's death, David Gilly was arrested for her murder. Ishragors, making new friends and moving beyond their high school relationship. Investigators also concluded that David had stalked Laura, and her mother, Laureen, had encouraged her to seek a restraining order, although Laura was too afraid to do so. Investigators reconstructed that David persuaded Laura to accompany him to the secluded Lover's Lane area, where he repeatedly struck her with rocks. After blood got on his jeans, investigators believed he removed them and left them at the crime scene before driving Laura's car back to her workplace. During the 2006 trial, the defense argued that another unidentified man's DNA showed someone else committed the crime. However, the jury rejected that argument, found David Gilly guilty on all charges, and sentenced him to life in prison. Dan Goodwin fulfilled the promise he made at Laura's funeral, while Laura's mother fulfilled her promise to continue seeking justice for her daughter. The investigation ultimately closed a long, unresolved chapter in Laura's case, providing answers through the renewed examination of evidence and allowing those who worked to find justice for Laura after years. Julie Buskin was born and raised in Benton, Arkansas, before moving to Oklahoma City to attend Oklahoma University. While pursuing a bachelor's degree in dance, she worked at the university golf course to support herself during college. Her long-term goal was to become a ballet instructor and eventually open a dance studio where she could teach children. Friends and classmates described Julie as talented, popular, and someone who had built many friendships during her time at the university. On the 19th of December, 1996, Julie spent part of the evening with her coworker Ryan James at his grandparents' house. After sharing dinner together, they watched a movie and made plans to have lunch the following day. Julie remained there until about 10 p.m. when she left to meet another group of friends. The gathering with those friends included a game of Monopoly and the exchange of Christmas gifts. The occasion also served as an opportunity to say goodbye because Julie's college semester had ended, and she planned to return home to Arkansas the next day. Her roommate, Megan, attended the gathering as well. Julie had already agreed to drive Megan to Will Rogers Airport early the following morning before beginning her own trip home. Rather than sleeping for only a short time before the early departure, Julie and Megan decided to stay awake through the night. Their plan reflected the schedule they needed to keep for the airport trip the next morning. With the semester finished, holiday plans approaching, and preparations underway for the drive to the airport, Julie's final evening unfolded through ordinary moments spent with friends, co-workers, and her roommate before the events that followed. Julie and Megan left their friend's house during the early morning hours of the 20th of December 1996 and drove to a restaurant called The Kettle at approximately 2 a.m. After finishing their meal, they stopped at a gas station, purchased gasoline, and each got a cappuccino before returning to their apartment shortly after 3 a.m. Megan gathered the belongings she needed for her upcoming flight, while Julie prepared to continue the morning according to their planned schedule. Around 4:30 a.m., the two women left the apartment and began the drive to Will Rogers Airport. The trip took about 30 minutes. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Julie dropped Megan off at the terminal. Megan watched as Julie drove away in her Red Eagle Summit, marking the last confirmed sighting of Julie before she disappeared. Shortly afterward, events unfolded near the Dublin West Apartments, where Julie lived. Several residents reported hearing a woman scream in terror from the apartment complex parking lot. One resident called 911 to report what had been heard. During the call, the resident explained that the scream sounded extremely alarming and admitted being too afraid to go outside to investigate the source. Later that day, Ryan James arrived at Julie's apartment for the lunch they had planned during their visit the previous evening. Julie was not there, and her vehicle was also missing. Concerned by her absence, Ryan reported her missing. Not long afterward, Julie's parents arrived from Arkansas, expecting to help their daughter move home after the semester had ended. Instead of meeting Julie, they found police officers waiting. They were informed that Julie could not be located, confirming that she had disappeared sometime after leaving the airport that morning. Approximately 12 hours after Julie Buskin disappeared, her body was discovered on the bank of a lake about 15 miles from her apartment. Investigators documented the condition of the scene as they began examining the area. Julie's hands had been tied behind her back with a pair of shoelaces, and the upper half of her body was in the water. An autopsy later determined that she had been killed by a single contact gunshot wound to the back of her head from a .22 caliber firearm. The examination also found evidence indicating that she had been assaulted, but investigators did not draw additional conclusions from that finding at the time. As investigators searched the shoreline, they identified important physical evidence preserved in the sand. 2 separate sets of footprints led toward the water, but only one set of prints returned from the lakeside. One trail belonged to Julie, while investigators believed the other had been left by the person responsible for her death. After consulting with Nike, the footprint was determined to be consistent with a men's size 9 Nike Air running shoe. Another significant discovery was made approximately 20 feet from Julie's body. Investigators recovered a crumpled pink leotard bearing the initials JB on its label, identifying it as Julie's. Testing revealed the presence of male DNA on the garment. Recognizing that forensic science continued to advance, investigators carefully preserved the DNA evidence for future analysis when improved technology became available. By the conclusion of the initial crime scene investigation, authorities possessed multiple pieces of forensic evidence, including ballistic findings, footprints, and DNA. Despite those discoveries, they still had no identified suspect to connect directly to the crime. Following the examination of the crime scene, investigators expanded their focus to Julie Buskin's personal life. Detectives interviewed her friends, classmates, co-workers, and other acquaintances from Oklahoma University, hoping someone could identify a possible motive or point them toward a suspect. Those interviews consistently produced the same picture. Julie was well-liked, had many friends, and no one described ongoing disputes, known enemies, or difficult romantic relationships that could explain why she had been targeted. Investigators also searched Julie's apartment. Inside, they found everything in orderly condition. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and nothing suggesting violence had occurred there before her disappearance. Attention then shifted to Julie's Red Eagle Summit, which was eventually located only 1 block from her apartment complex. During the examination of the vehicle, investigators noticed red sand on the floor that appeared similar to the sand found near the lakeside where Julie's body had been recovered. The discovery raised an important question because the vehicle appeared to have been returned close to the area where the abduction had begun. Despite careful processing, the vehicle produced little useful forensic evidence. Investigators found no foreign hairs, fibers, fingerprints, or indications that a struggle had taken place inside. Julie's missing cellular phone became another important focus of the investigation. Phone records showed that after Julie had died, 2 outgoing calls had been placed. One call was made to a weather forecast, while the second was placed to a telephone number that was not in service. Even with these investigative leads and a $70,000 reward, no suspect was identified, and the investigation gradually became a cold case. Approximately 1 month after Julie's death, an important witness contacted police. The witness reported nearly colliding with a vehicle matching Julie's near the lake on the night of the crime. After following the vehicle for several miles, intending to confront the driver, the witness observed the driver repeatedly looking back through the rearview mirror before speeding away. Based on the witness's observations, investigators created a composite sketch depicting a young man who may have been Hispanic, possessed long black hair, and had a muscular build. Despite repeated media broadcasts, nobody identified the individual, and the investigation remained without answers. 4.5 years later, police received information from a female inmate identifying Dennis Sturmer as someone who might have been involved. Investigators noted he lived only 4 blocks from Julie's apartment, resembled the composite sketch, and was 23 years old at the time. Sturmer refused questioning and declined to provide DNA voluntarily, requiring investigators to obtain a court order. DNA analysis showed Sturmer's profile was very similar to the DNA recovered from Julie's leotard, but was not an actual match. Investigators then tested his only immediate male relative, his brother, whose DNA also failed to match. With no conclusive evidence, investigators continued expanding DNA testing, eventually collecting samples from more than 200 men connected to Julie. Despite those extensive efforts, no definitive match was identified, and the investigation remained unresolved. Investigators continued reviewing existing evidence while comparing newly collected DNA samples against the profile recovered from Julie's leotard. Although the testing effort became increasingly broad, Each comparison ended without identifying the person responsible. After examining hundreds of potential connections and receiving no confirmed match, the investigation remained open, but the case continued without a suspect who could be directly linked to the available forensic evidence. 6 years after Julie Buskin's death, the investigation finally gained significant momentum. Anthony Castillo Sanchez was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, and as part of that arrest, law enforcement collected his DNA. Investigators soon discovered several details that drew their attention. Sanchez had lived approximately 1 mile from Julie's apartment at the time of the crime. One of his former girlfriends also provided investigators with a diary entry stating that Anthony had purchased matching Nike running shoes for both of them. Records further showed that he wore a men's size 9 shoe, consistent with the footprint evidence recovered near the lake. Investigators uncovered additional circumstantial evidence while reviewing Sanchez's background. One former girlfriend's telephone number differed by only 1 digit from the number dialed from Julie's phone after her death. Authorities considered the possibility that the caller had attempted to reach that number but entered one incorrect digit. Investigators also learned that Anthony and his father regularly fired .22 caliber firearms inside the rental home where they lived. Ballistics testing later determined that a bullet recovered from the residence had been fired from the same firearm used to kill Julie. In 2004, investigators compared Anthony Sanchez's DNA with the male DNA recovered from Julie's pink leotard. The results confirmed a match. Sanchez had been 18 years old when the crime occurred. He was convicted in 2006 and sentenced to death. Through 2023, Sanchez continued appealing his conviction, claiming his father had committed the crime instead. His father reportedly confessed before his death in 2022, but investigators had already examined that possibility. Court records stated that the DNA match probabilities strongly supported Anthony Sanchez as the source of the DNA recovered from Julie's leotard. "15-year-old Lynda Mann lived in Narborough, Leicestershire, where she attended Lutterworth Grammar School and Community College. Lynda was the younger sister of Susan Mann, who was 2 years older. Their mother, Kathleen Mann, moved to Narborough after her marriage ended and later married Edward Eastwood in 1980, when Susan was 14 and Lynda was 12. Lynda was described as a typical teenager. She was quiet but popular, enjoyed school, and liked spending time with her friends. She was interested in the experiences of growing up, including music, hairstyles, makeup, and clothes. When money for clothing was limited, Lynda would babysit to earn money and make her own dresses. On the 21st of November, 1983, Lynda left to walk to a friend's house, but she never arrived. Before leaving, she had promised Kathleen and Edward that she would be home by 10 p.m. As the night passed and Lynda still had not returned, her parents became increasingly concerned. By midnight, they contacted the police, and a search began through the night. At 7:20 a.m. the following morning, a hospital porter discovered Lynda's body while walking to work. At first, he believed he had found a mannequin. Lynda had been assaulted and strangled. Her jeans had been removed, her other clothing was scattered, and a scarf was found around her neck. The scarf had been used to strangle her, marking the discovery of a crime that shocked the community. The investigation into Lynda's death would begin a search for the person responsible, as police worked to understand the events surrounding her disappearance in Narborough. Following Lynda's murder, investigators began the task of identifying the person responsible for her death. In Narborough, residents were horrified by the crime, and young girls were encouraged to walk in groups afterward as concerns grew within the community. Police searched the immediate area around the crime scene, but they were unable to find anything useful. Only a few hundred yards away was a local psychiatric hospital. Some people believe the attacker could have been a patient from the hospital, but investigators found no evidence to support that idea. During Lynda's autopsy, male DNA was collected from her body. Testing showed that the individual had type A blood. This meant that around 10% of the adult male population in England could potentially have been responsible. Edward Eastwood provided a blood sample during the investigation, but testing showed that he was not part of the same group. Investigators continued their work by visiting houses and speaking with residents to gather information. They also created a list of offenders connected to similar crimes in Leicestershire and questioned them as part of their search for answers. The investigation also received a call from someone who claimed to have seen a spiky-haired youth near the crime scene around the time of Lynda's murder. The caller reported the sighting, but the person described was never identified. Police continued their efforts to locate the individual responsible while examining all available information connected to the case and seeking further details that could help solve Lynda's murder. After 3 years of investigation into Lynda Mann's murder, another tragedy occurred in 1986 with the death of 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth from Inderby, Leicestershire. Dawn lived with her parents and her brother Andrew. She was gifted at drawing and worked part-time at a newsagent shop in Inderby. On the 31st of July 1986, Dawn left work at 4 p.m. and headed toward a friend's house in Narborough. She was expected to return home by 7 p.m. Dawn was last seen at 4:40 p.m. bypassing motorists on King Edward Avenue. When she had not returned by 7:30 p.m., her parents became concerned and searched for her. At 9:40 p.m., they contacted police, fearing that Dawn may have suffered the same fate as Lynda Mann. Police later discovered Dawn's body in a field beside 10 Pound Lane. Like Lynda, Dawn had been assaulted and strangled. Male DNA collected from Dawn's body showed that the attacker had the same blood type as the person responsible for Lynda's murder. Investigators identified several similarities between the two cases. Both victims were teenagers, both were walking alone, and both attended Lutterworth Grammar School and Community College. Both girls were found after being assaulted and strangled, and both crimes occurred near footpaths. These similarities led investigators to believe the two murders were connected. The connection between the cases became a central part of the investigation as police examined the evidence from both crime scenes. Investigators continued working to understand whether the same individual was responsible for both attacks, and used the similarities between Lynda's and Dawn's deaths to guide their search for answers in the ongoing murder investigation. Following Dawn's murder, police continued their investigation by establishing a mobile incident room at the foot of 10 Pound Lane to gather information from villagers and passers-by. Around 200 telephone calls were received, and dozens of people visited the unit. Investigators received reports of a young man wearing a red crash helmet on a motorcycle near the area around the time Dawn disappeared. Another important source of information was a 17-year-old kitchen porter from Carlton Hayes Hospital, the psychiatric hospital located near both crime scenes. The porter told police that he had seen Dawn on the day she disappeared. Investigators later discovered that the kitchen porter had shared information about Dawn's body location before police had publicly discovered it. His statements included details about where the body had been found, creating suspicion among investigators. Police arrested him and identified him as Richard Buckland. During interviews, Buckland gave inconsistent statements to investigators. He admitted that he had seen Dawn and spoken with her through his rambles. He confessed and later took back his statements. During a later interview, Buckland provided detailed information about the crime scene that had not been released publicly. Before Buckland's trial, investigators used a new scientific method called genetic fingerprinting, developed by Dr. Alec Jeffries at Leicester University. DNA evidence from both crime scenes was tested, showing that Buckland was not responsible for either murder. However, the testing confirmed that the same man had committed both crimes. Buckland became the first person exonerated through DNA profiling. The results confirmed that the investigation had identified the connection between the two crimes, while showing that DNA profiling could reveal the identity of the person responsible in criminal investigations too. After Richard Buckland's release, Inspector Derek Pierce took charge of the investigation into the murders of Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. Pierce reviewed 1,800 messages from the public, including information about people who had been considered during the earlier investigation. Investigators expanded the use of DNA testing by asking unalibied male residents between the ages of 17 and 34 inches nearby villages to voluntarily provide blood and saliva samples. The public announcement was made on the 2nd of January 1987. By the end of January, 1,000 men had taken tests, and by May, 3,653 men had participated. However, the testing process was slowed because of the workload placed on investigators and laboratory staff. In September 1987, police received a breakthrough when a woman contacted them about a conversation she overheard at the Clarendon pub in Leicester. She reported that Ian Kelly had spoken about taking a blood test for his friend Colin Pitchfork. Investigators examined Pitchfork's background and found that he had a previous record for flashing women. They also discovered that the signature connected to his blood test did not match his own signature. Pitchfork had convinced Ian Kelly to provide a blood sample on his behalf because he feared suspicion due to his history. Police arrested Colin Pitchfork, and investigators believed he was responsible for the murders of Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth based on the evidence collected during the investigation. The arrest followed the discovery that Pitchfork's actions had led investigators to connect him with the two crimes and provided a path toward resolving the case through DNA evidence. The investigation showed how genetic testing could identify the perpetrator. On the 22nd of January 1988, 28-year-old Colin Pitchfork went on trial at Leicester Crown Court. Before the trial, Ian Kelly received an 18-month prison sentence suspended for 2 years for his involvement in providing the false blood sample. Pitchfork pleaded guilty to the murders of Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth and received a double life sentence. Investigators and Lynda's family reacted strongly to the outcome. Edward Eastwood described seeing Pitchfork in court and said he looked at him directly. Kathleen Mann recalled the shock of seeing photographs of Lynda presented during the trial. The case also left questions about Richard Buckland and how he knew details about Dawn Ashworth's crime scene. Investigators believed he may have discovered the body while walking to work, and that his confession was influenced by his circumstances. The murders of Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth became significant in the history of forensic science. Dr. Alec Jeffrey's genetic fingerprinting helped advance DNA technology and contributed to solving future cases. The case demonstrated the importance of DNA evidence in criminal investigations. Thousands of cold cases have since been solved through DNA technology, showing the lasting impact of the investigation into Lynda and Dawn's murders. The scientific developments connected to this case changed how investigations could identify offenders and provided new possibilities for solving crimes that had remained unsolved. Debbie Davis was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, on the 15th of July 1952. After school, she entered adulthood and had a brief marriage that later ended in divorce. Following this, Debbie moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she followed her cousin Judy Fisk and settled into an apartment on Devonshire Street in the Westover Hills neighborhood. There, she built a quiet life while becoming established in the community. In 1985, Debbie began working as an accounts manager for Style Weekly, a Richmond-based media outlet. Outside of work, she had a strong interest in pop culture and enjoyed listening to Bruce Springsteen records. She was also an avid reader of mystery novels and worked part-time at the Walden Bookstore, located at Cloverleaf Mall in Chesterfield County. Debbie also appeared as an extra in the HBO movie Finnegan Begin Again, adding another experience to her varied interests and activities. On the evening of the 18th of September, 1987, Debbie and her coworker Deanna Hoff took a road trip to Virginia Beach to see a performance by Dana Carvey. After the show, Deanna drove Debbie back to her apartment and waited until she was safely inside before leaving. Neither woman knew that this would be the last time Deanna would see Debbie alive. The following events would begin the investigation into Debbie's disappearance and tragic case. The account of Debbie's life before her disappearance provides the details of a woman who lived quietly in Richmond, maintained her career, and continued pursuing personal interests before the events that changed everything. The morning after Debbie Davis was last seen, Arnold Ellis noticed a Renault Alliance parked in front of his house. The vehicle's motor was running, the keys remained in the ignition, and there was no sign of the driver. Ellis contacted police, who determined that the car belonged to Debbie Davis. She lived one street away from where the vehicle had been found. An officer went to Debbie's apartment and knocked on the door, but received no response. An elderly neighbor arrived and provided a key to enter the residence. Inside, the officer discovered Debbie in the bedroom. She was wearing limited clothing. Investigators determined that her right arm had been restrained behind her back. Her left arm had been held beneath her, and she had been unable to breathe. Investigators found that the person involved had used a rocking chair taken from a nearby porch to gain access through Debbie's kitchen window. On the nightstand beside Debbie's bed was a mystery novel she had been reading, titled Presumed Innocent. The book contained fictional events involving a woman being restrained and facing danger, a detail investigators noted while examining the location. Authorities believe the person involved had experience because no fingerprints, witnesses, or clear evidence that anything had been taken were found. Detective Ray Williams noted that it was unusual for someone to spend that much time with another person and leave so few clues. The investigation began with limited evidence, leaving detectives searching for answers about what happened to Debbie. Investigators continued examining the circumstances surrounding the incident, focusing on the method of entry, the condition of the apartment, and the absence of obvious leads. The early investigation revealed a case with many unanswered questions and few answers for detectives. Following Debbie Davis's case, investigators continued searching for answers and worked to identify anyone who could have been connected to what happened. Lorna Wyckoff, the founder of Style Weekly, offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Investigators examined Debbie's personal life and relationships to determine whether someone close to her could have been involved. Detectives found no obvious suspect among the people who knew Debbie. The information available showed that Debbie lived a quiet life in Richmond. She was not dating anyone at the time of the incident, had not seen her ex-husband in years, did not use illegal substances, and did not spend time in bars. Investigators found no clear reason or direct evidence after reviewing her background and personal connections. The case remained difficult because detectives had limited evidence and no witnesses, fingerprints, or other clues that could immediately identify the person involved. Investigators continued working through the available information while searching for a connection that could explain what happened. Only 2 weeks after Debbie's case, another tragedy occurred in Richmond, beginning a series of events that investigators would later connect to Debbie's situation. The new investigation would introduce further individuals and linked events. Susan Elizabeth Helms was born on the 6th of February 1955 in Charleston, South Carolina. She later moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she worked on her neurosurgery residency at the Medical College of Virginia. Susan married Marcel Slagg, and the couple lived in the Woodland Heights neighborhood of Richmond. On the 3rd of October 1987, Marcel returned home at 1:45 a.m. after Susan had worked late. As he entered the house, he heard movement upstairs and believed Susan was awake, thinking he may have disturbed her. After taking a shower, Marcel quietly entered their dark bedroom. There, he discovered Susan's body partially outside their bedroom closet. Investigators found similarities between Susan's murder and the death of Debbie Davis. Susan had been assaulted and strangled, and her hands had been bound tightly behind her back with an extension cord and necktie. Investigators also discovered that her bedroom window was wide open. Detective Ray Williams, who had worked on Debbie's case, was assigned to investigate both cases. Investigators believe the perpetrator was still inside the house when Marcel arrived because movement had been heard upstairs. They determined the suspect appeared to have escaped through the balcony window outside the bedroom. Outside that window, investigators found an open Vaseline jar left behind by the perpetrator. They traced the purchase of the jar to a store near Cloverleaf Mall, but the lead did not provide investigators with the answers they were seeking. The investigation continued as detectives worked to determine whether the evidence connected the two Richmond crimes. Diane Cho was born in Korea in 1972, and in 1984, she immigrated to the United States with her family. In 1987, Diane was a 15-year-old freshman at Manchester High School. She was very smart and helped care for her parents, who spoke little English. Diane began experiencing disturbing, recurring nightmares about an unknown man following her. She told friends at school that she sometimes saw a person matching the figure from her dreams at the mall. In November 1987, Diane went to Cloverleaf Mall with a friend to see The Princess Bride. During the visit, Diane became frightened and pointed out a person in the parking lot as the man who had been following her. On the 21st of November, 1987, Diane's parents arrived home around 9 p.m. Her mother gave her a haircut, and later the family went to bed. Around midnight, they heard Diane typing an English paper in her bedroom across the hall. The next day, Diane's parents called home around 2 p.m. to remind their children about an afternoon church service. Diane's brother answered the phone, but Diane remained asleep. When Diane's parents returned home, her mother went to her bedroom and discovered her daughter's body. Diane had been tied with rope, strangled, assaulted, and found with her bedroom window open. The similarities between Diane's death and the previous crimes became clear to investigators, who recognized repeated patterns involving the victims and the circumstances surrounding each case. The investigation continued as authorities examined the connections between them. Sue Tucker was a 44-year-old editor for a Department of Agriculture magazine who lived in Arlington County, Virginia. Her husband, Reg Tucker, had moved to Wales to work as a photography teacher, while Sue prepared their home for sale and planned to join him. Sue and Reg wanted to leave the United States because they were concerned about increasing violence. A neighbor, Audrey Sislove, became concerned after she was unable to reach Sue for several days. Audrey noticed that Sue's bedroom window had remained open and became worried about her friend. When authorities checked the home, they discovered Sue's badly decomposed body lying on her bed. She had been tightly bound with nylon ropes, strangled, and assaulted. Investigators found no fingerprints, and evidence showed that the perpetrator had entered through a small basement laundry room window. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator had spent time inside the home and left behind a partially eaten orange after preparing a snack. Arlington investigators recognized similarities between Sue's murder and the 1,984 killing of attorney Carolyn Hamm. David Vasquez had confessed to Hamm's death and was serving a prison sentence. but investigators questioned how similar crimes could continue while he was incarcerated. Investigators determined Vasquez was not responsible and recognized that both Richmond and Arlington had been affected by an unknown serial offender. The connection between the cases became clearer as investigators compared the details of the crimes and examined the evidence available in each investigation. Authorities continued searching for the person responsible for the attacks, while reviewing the similarities that linked the victims across different locations. The discoveries surrounding Sue Tucker's death added another case to the growing investigation involving Richmond and Arlington. Detectives continued working to understand how the crimes were connected and identify the unknown offender responsible for the violence. Investigators focused on identifying Timothy Spencer as the possible offender after comparing the connected crimes in Arlington and Richmond. Earlier attacks from 1,983 and 1,984, including assaults on 9 women, showed similarities involving break-ins, tied victims, and strangulation methods. Investigators had originally believed David Vasquez was responsible for Carolyn Hamm's murder, but later determined he was not involved after reviewing the details of the crimes. Richmond Detective Ray Williams and Arlington Detective Joe Horgus shared information about the cases and concluded that the same person was likely responsible for the Richmond murders and possibly Hamm's death. Investigators examined the timeline of the attacks, noting the gap between the 1,983 1,984 crimes and the 1,987 attacks. The FBI believed the offender likely had been imprisoned for another offense during that period. Investigators then focused on Tommy Spencer, who had previous burglary arrests and had been paroled to a Richmond halfway house in 1987. Detectives discovered that Spencer had signed himself out on evenings when crimes occurred and had connections to locations linked to the investigation, including Cloverleaf Mall. On the 20th of January 1988, investigators took Spencer into custody and collected a sample of his blood. With no witnesses or fingerprints directly tying him to the crimes, investigators relied on the new forensic method of DNA fingerprinting. Testing matched Spencer's DNA to evidence from Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, Sue Tucker, and assault victims from Arlington and Richmond. The DNA analysis provided investigators with the evidence needed to connect Spencer to the series of crimes across the 2 regions. The forensic breakthrough became a critical part of the investigation because earlier evidence had failed to identify the offender. Investigators now had a direct link between Spencer and the attacks that had remained unsolved for years as they continued building the case against the suspected offender. Timothy Spencer's trial began in July 1988. Known as the Southside Strangler, Spencer faced the legal consequences of the crimes connected to the investigation. After a 6-day trial, he was found guilty and became the first person convicted based on DNA evidence in the United States. Spencer received multiple life sentences for the crimes linked to the investigation. The case also returned to the question of Carolyn Hamm's murder and the wrongful conviction of David Vasquez. Vasquez became a suspect after Carolyn reported him peeping on her. Investigators obtained a false confession by revealing details of the crime to Vasquez, who repeated those details back to them. Later, DNA evidence showed that Vasquez was not responsible for Carolyn Hamm's murder and led to his release. Vasquez became the first person in the United States to be exonerated because of DNA evidence. The investigation ultimately ended with the execution of Timothy Wilson Spencer on the 27th of April, 1994 at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. Spencer was strapped into the electric chair, bringing an end to the crime spree described throughout the investigation. The legal outcome marked the final chapter in the case that connected the victims, investigations, and evidence that led authorities to Spencer. The execution concluded the pursuit of justice, following years of investigation into the crimes committed across Richmond and Arlington. The resolution followed the trial, conviction, DNA evidence, and exoneration process that changed the understanding of the investigation and confirmed the connections between Spencer and the related crimes. Kathy Odom was known as Kathy by her family and friends. Before the events that would later change her family forever, Kathy built her life around those closest to her. She met Mike Odom when they were both 16 years old and attending high school. The two began dating and eventually decided they wanted to marry. Before they could begin their marriage, Mike was arrested for selling heroin to an undercover officer. He received a 6-year sentence for the crime, but served only 2 years. During that time, Kathy told her family that she was determined to marry Mike once he was released. After Mike's release, Kathy and Mike married and started a family together. They later had 2 children, Tasha and Sean, and lived in Harris County, Texas. Kathy worked to make their marriage succeed and was described by those close to her as a loving mother who cared deeply for her children. Kathy's father, Frankie Martin, helped support the family by giving Mike a job at his sign business. Kathy was committed to her family and was remembered as someone who would have done anything for her children. This period of Kathy's life established the family and relationships that existed before the events of the 3rd of March, 1987. Dedication to her children and family remains central to how those who knew her described her. On the night of the 3rd of March, 1987, Mike Odom attempted to contact Kathy while he was away working out of town. Kathy was expected to be home with their children, so it was alarming when she did not answer the phone. Concerned about the situation, Mike called their next-door neighbor and asked him to check on Kathy and the children. The neighbor went to the Odom home and knocked on the door, but there was no response. He looked through the windows and saw that the television was still on inside the house. Instead of immediately calling police, the neighbor drove into town, found a police officer, and returned with him to the residence. When they arrived, the officer found that the front door was unlocked. Inside the living room, 4-year-old Tasha was found on the sofa. She had been badly beaten and was unconscious, but she was still alive. 2-month-old Sean was discovered unharmed in his bedroom. In Kathy and Mike's bedroom, officers found Kathy's battered body. She had been severely beaten, stabbed more than 16 times, strangled, assaulted, and her wrists were bound with the cord from a lamp. The condition of the scene showed investigators that Kathy had suffered a violent attack. Both children were taken to the hospital following the discovery at the home. Officers feared that the person responsible for the attack could return and harm Tasha further. Medical care was provided as doctors worked to save the children's lives. The investigation began with the discovery of the attack and the immediate efforts to protect the surviving children after they were found inside the Odom residence on that night. Frankie Martin arrived at the crime scene after learning that something had happened at his daughter Kathy's home. Investigators directed him to go to the hospital and be with his grandchildren. While there, Frankie learned what happened to Kathy through a television report. Back at the Odom residence, Mike Odom eventually arrived, and investigators immediately paid close attention to his appearance and actions. Officers noticed red stains on Mike's shirt that appeared to look like blood. A search of the home also revealed blood in the bathroom, causing investigators to believe that someone may have attempted to clean up before leaving. Police found no signs of forced entry into the house. All doors were locked except the front door, which suggested that Kathy may have known the person responsible for the attack. Investigators also noted that Kathy's clothes were found neatly folded on the floor. The number of stab wounds led them to believe the crime was personal. They theorized that Tasha may have been attacked as a way to force Kathy to cooperate with the perpetrator. Investigators examined Mike's timeline and discovered that he did not return directly home from work as he had claimed. Instead, he had gone out with friends. Police also investigated Mike's friend Tim Robinson after finding unusual stains in his vehicle. Forensic testing showed the stains in Tim's car were motor oil and the stains on Mike's shirt were paint. Coworkers provided alibis for both men, and both passed polygraph tests, ruling them out. Investigators moved their attention to Greg Marquardt, who was married to Kathy's sister, Shelley Martin. Greg and Mike Odom had been close during their involvement in the drug scene, a connection that brought Greg into the investigation. Shelley was 16 when she met Greg, who was 25 at the time, and they married in 1983. Unlike Kathy and Mike, who had changed their lives, Greg and Shelley continued struggling with addiction and criminal activity. They were frequently in and out of jail and had previously stolen from Shelley's parents for money. Kathy also told a friend that Greg had made unwanted advances toward her during a visit, which became part of the investigation. Investigators found evidence connecting Greg to the crime scene, including his fingerprints and hair throughout the house. However, they recognized this was not conclusive because Greg was a family member who had visited many times. Kathy's parents suspected Greg, and Frankie became suspicious when Shelley and Greg attempted to visit Tasha at the hospital in the middle of the night. When Tasha saw Greg at the hospital, she became frightened. However, investigators could not confirm whether Greg was the person she had seen inside the house because her injuries affected her memory. Greg told investigators about his attraction to Kathy, particularly his fixation on her stomach. This fixation was so noticeable that Kathy had mentioned his behavior to friends. Investigators considered these statements while examining Greg's possible involvement in the attack. The information about his interest in Kathy's stomach became another detail reviewed during the investigation, as authorities continued searching for answers about the events that led to Kathy's death and attack. After the case went cold, Kathy's murder remained unresolved until advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to reopen the investigation. In 1998, a cold case team was formed and began reviewing the evidence connected to Kathy's death. By that time, DNA testing had become reliable enough to create a DNA profile from biological evidence collected in the case. Testing showed that Greg Marquardt was among the small percentage of people who could have been the source of the biological evidence. While this result was not enough by itself to prove guilt, it represented a significant development compared to earlier blood type testing. Previous serology testing only showed that Greg's blood type was consistent with the perpetrators, but approximately half of the population shared that same blood type, making the result inconclusive. Greg provided investigators with an explanation that he and Kathy had been having a consensual affair. He claimed that he had been with her on the morning of her death, but said she was alive when he left. Investigators did not arrest him at that time because they believed stronger evidence was needed to prove he was present when the crime occurred. The investigation later included forensic specialist Catherine Long and her work at Cellmark. She and investigators examined whether skin cells could transfer during strangulation. Investigators decided to examine the electrical cord used to bind Kathy because it may have contained evidence from the attacker. The cord had been preserved in a paper bag, which helped preserve DNA evidence. This preservation allowed investigators to continue examining the item for possible genetic material that could help identify the person responsible for Kathy's attack and death. Investigators finally obtained the evidence needed to arrest Greg Marquardt when testing of the electrical cord revealed two genetic profiles: Kathy Odom's and Greg Marquardt's. Investigators determined that Greg's DNA could only have been present on the cord if he was the perpetrator. On the 18th of December 2002, Greg was arrested and charged with Kathy's murder. While incarcerated, Greg confessed details of the crime to a fellow inmate. According to the information provided, Greg said he was high on heroin when he drove to Kathy's house. He described entering the home and making advances toward Kathy, which she rejected. He admitted striking Tasha repeatedly in the head and threatening Sean's life to force Kathy to comply. Greg said he used a kitchen knife, cut the electrical cord from a lamp, bound Kathy's hands, assaulted her, killed her, cleaned up in the bathroom, and changed into Mike Odom's clothing. 6 months after his arrest, Greg inherited money and part ownership of a home after his aunt's death. The Martins filed a lawsuit that prevented him from using those funds for his defense. In 2004, Greg pleaded guilty and was convicted of all charges against him. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison and died in 2008 from liver disease after serving 4 years. Shelley continued supporting Greg for some time and believed in his innocence. The Martins later moved to Oklahoma. Frankie Martin said losing Kathy remained difficult and that he would always remember her. He always remembered her love deeply. At the Inco gas station in Winnebago, Wisconsin, along Highway 41, about 60 miles southwest of Green Bay, Wayne Pratt faced the tragic events that would change the course of his life on June 12. 1963. Wayne was known as a kind-hearted man who was deeply loved by those around him, especially his wife, Marie Pratt, to whom he was a devoted and caring husband. The evening began as an ordinary one, with Wayne at home relaxing and watching television before an unexpected sound interrupted the quiet routine. Around 8:40 p.m., a car pulled up to the gas station, drawing Wayne away from his evening and toward the station to see if the driver needed gas or assistance. Diligent and always ready to help, Wayne had no reason to believe that the encounter would become dangerous or that it would lead to a devastating outcome. As time passed and Wayne did not return home, Marie became increasingly concerned. The minutes continued to pass, and her worry grew as she felt that something was wrong. Marie eventually decided to go to the gas station herself in hopes of finding Wayne there with a late customer or working at the station. When she arrived, Marie found the usually active location unusually quiet. She entered the building and discovered Wayne's lifeless body in the back room, covered by a blanket. The shocking discovery revealed the tragedy that had occurred. Overcome with grief and disbelief, Marie immediately called police and reported the discovery, beginning the investigation into Wayne Pratt's death, and the search continued. After Marie Pratt reported the discovery of her husband's body, authorities arrived at the Inco gas station and began examining the circumstances surrounding Wayne Pratt's death. They listened as Marie explained how she had found Wayne in the back room of the building, leading investigators into the early stages of the investigation. The details of the attack soon revealed the extreme violence Wayne had suffered. Investigators discovered that Wayne had been stabbed 53 times, a shocking act that showed the severity of the crime and deeply affected those working to understand what had happened. The number of wounds indicated a possible level of rage and personal animosity, making the attack even more difficult for investigators to comprehend. Yet, despite the brutality of the crime, evidence was discovered that offered a possible path toward identifying the person responsible. Blood found at the scene did not belong to Wayne, suggesting that the attacker may also have been injured during the struggle. This evidence provided investigators with an important clue because it showed that the person responsible had left behind biological material that could potentially reveal their identity. However, investigators still face significant challenges despite this discovery. The available information did not explain exactly how the events unfolded that night or what occurred inside the gas station. The evidence created hope, but it could not immediately provide the answers needed to solve the case. The investigation continued as authorities worked to uncover more information, but the unanswered questions remained unresolved. The promising clue was not enough to identify the attacker at that time, and the search for answers would continue for many years. After the initial investigation into Wayne Pratt's death, authorities were unable to uncover additional details, explaining exactly what had happened inside the Inco gas station or identify the person responsible for the attack. Investigators continued pursuing available leads, but each effort ended without the evidence needed to make an arrest. As weeks became months and months became years, the search for answers grew increasingly difficult, leaving the case without meaningful progress despite continued investigative work. Gradually, the investigation shifted from an active effort into a cold case. The intense attention surrounding Wayne's death slowly faded as no significant breakthroughs emerged and no new evidence came forward to move the investigation ahead. By the late 1960s, the case had largely stalled. Limited resources, combined with the absence of fresh information, left law enforcement with little choice but to reduce their investigative efforts. Although the case remained open, it no longer advanced at the pace seen during the early stages following the crime. The absence of answers continued to affect Wayne's family and the Winnebago community, who remained without a clear understanding of what had happened on the night of the 12th of June, 1963. Decades passed without a resolution, and the investigation remained an enduring mystery. Nearly 5 decades after Wayne's death, the evidence collected during the original investigation still existed, even though earlier investigative methods had been unable to produce a definitive result. As forensic science continued to advance over the years, those preserved materials gained renewed importance. Improvements in DNA technology would eventually provide investigators with an opportunity to re-examine the evidence using techniques unavailable during the original investigation, offering a new chance to pursue answers that had remained beyond reach for decades. In 2011, nearly 5 decades after Wayne Pratt's death, investigators reopened the case with renewed determination to examine the evidence using advancements in forensic science that had not been available during the original investigation. Their objective was to determine whether modern DNA technology could uncover information capable of identifying the person responsible for the crime. Evidence collected years earlier was carefully reviewed, offering investigators another opportunity to pursue answers that had remained out of reach for decades. Particular attention centered on the blanket that had been found covering Wayne's body. Investigators believed it might contain genetic material left behind during the attack, making it one of the most significant pieces of evidence preserved from the original investigation. By 2015, Sorensen Forensics examined the blanket and identified DNA mixtures within the evidence. This discovery renewed optimism because it demonstrated that valuable genetic information was present and could potentially assist the investigation if it could be properly analyzed. Despite that encouraging development, investigators encountered another major obstacle. The DNA samples contain multiple genetic profiles, making them too complex to isolate into a single, clear profile suitable for comparison through national DNA databases. Without a complete profile, authorities could not identify a matching individual, and the investigation again reached a frustrating standstill. Even with those limitations, investigators continued searching for answers rather than abandoning the case. The DNA evidence remained central to their efforts because they recognized that forensic science continued advancing. They understood that future improvements in analytical technology might eventually allow specialists to interpret the complicated DNA mixtures in ways previously impossible. Although immediate results remained unavailable, the preserved evidence continued offering hope that scientific progress could one day provide the breakthrough needed to move the investigation forward. In 2018, the investigation took another significant step when a warrant was issued for the arrest of William Dockstader, an 82-year-old man from Bowler, Wisconsin. Although this development marked important progress, Dockstader had not suddenly emerged as a suspect. Investigators had first identified him in the days following Wayne Pratt's death in 1963, placing his name within the investigation from its earliest stages. Over the decades, information concerning Dockstader continued resurfacing. Tips regarding his possible involvement appeared again in 1968 and later in 2022. Keeping him connected to the case despite the absence of conclusive proof. These recurring reports ensured that investigators never completely dismissed his potential involvement, even though the evidence available during those years remained insufficient to establish responsibility for Wayne Pratt's death. Throughout the investigation, authorities continued searching for evidence capable of definitively linking Dockstader to the crime. His repeated appearance within investigative records demonstrated that his name had remained relevant, but investigators required stronger scientific evidence before reaching any final conclusion. The case could not be resolved through suspicion alone, making forensic confirmation essential before determining whether he could be identified as the person responsible. More than half a century had passed since Wayne Pratt was killed, yet the investigation remained unresolved. During that time, forensic science continued advancing, providing investigators with increasingly sophisticated methods for examining preserved evidence. Those technological developments created the possibility that previously unresolved DNA evidence could finally be analyzed more effectively. As modern forensic techniques improved, investigators moved closer to determining whether William Dockstader could be conclusively connected to Wayne Pratt's death through scientific analysis alone. In 2023, investigators achieved the scientific breakthrough that finally moved Wayne Pratt's case toward resolution. Sorensen Forensics re-examined the preserved DNA evidence using updated technology, while cybergenetics applied true allele data analysis to evaluate the complex DNA mixtures recovered from the evidence. Together, these advanced forensic methods succeeded where earlier examinations had fallen short, providing investigators with the scientific results they had been pursuing for more than 6 decades. On the 16th of July 2024, the analysis revealed that William Dockstader's DNA was statistically identical to the DNA identified on the blanket that had covered Wayne Pratt's body. That finding established the long-awaited connection between Dockstader and the crime scene evidence. After more than 61 years without definitive answers, the results provided Wayne's family and the Winnebago community with the conclusion they had sought throughout the investigation. William Dockstader had died in 2022 at the age of 82. Meaning he was no longer alive to face criminal charges. Following the DNA findings, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office officially closed the cold case. The Winnebago County District Attorney's Office reviewed the available evidence and confirmed that had Dockstader been alive, there would have been sufficient grounds to charge him with the slaying. The conclusion of the investigation brought a measure of closure to a mystery that had remained unresolved for decades. Although the scientific evidence finally answered the central questions surrounding Wayne Pratt's death, it could not undo the loss experienced by those who knew him. Wayne Pratt's death remained a lasting tragedy, while the completed investigation ensured that the case would finally be remembered with a documented resolution. Danielle Houchins' story began with her birth in 1981 to her mother, Cheryl Houchins. From a young age, Danielle was affectionately known as Danny, a name that reflected the closeness and affection surrounding her within her family. She was deeply loved by her mother, and the bond between them was described as unbreakable. Danny held an important place in her family's life, and before the tragedy that followed, she was a daughter who brought love and meaning to those closest to her. On the 21st of September 1996, one 5-year-old, Danielle left her home in Belgrade, Montana, planning to spend the day fishing at Cambridge Fishing Access. The location was a popular spot that Danielle often visited, and the outing was intended to be a peaceful and solitary escape by the water. It appeared to be an ordinary day and another quiet visit to a place she knew well. However, Danielle did not return home later that day, changing what had started as a routine fishing trip into the beginning of a missing person investigation. Concern grew as hours passed, and search efforts began after her absence was noticed. Searchers eventually discovered Danielle's truck near the fishing access. The vehicle was left unlocked, with no immediate signs of a struggle, but Danielle herself was nowhere to be found. The discovery of the empty vehicle became the first major indication that something was wrong, as investigators began working to understand what had happened and locate Danielle while the search for answers moved forward immediately. After Danielle Hinn failed to return home on the 21st of September 1996, the search for the missing teenager intensified. Hours passed as concern for her safety continued to grow, and efforts focused on finding her and understanding what had happened during her fishing trip. The discovery of Danielle's truck near Cambridge Fishing Access had already raised serious concerns, but the search continued as investigators and others looked for answers. Several hours later, Danielle's lifeless body was found face down in shallow water, not far from where her truck had been discovered. The condition of the scene revealed evidence of assault, confirming that Danielle's death was the result of a violent act. The discovery transformed the missing person investigation into a homicide investigation as authorities worked to determine the circumstances surrounding her death. Based on the evidence gathered, investigators concluded that Danielle's attacker forced her head down into marshy ground and held her there until she suffocated. The information from the investigation revealed the tragic circumstances of Danielle's final moments, showing that her death involved a deliberate act of violence. Following the discovery of Danielle's body, investigators faced a central question that would remain unanswered for nearly 28 years. Who was responsible for taking Danielle Hinn's life? Despite efforts to identify the person responsible, the case remained unresolved. Danielle's family and investigators were left waiting for a breakthrough that could finally provide answers. The search for justice continued through decades of uncertainty, as the case remained an open and painful chapter for those seeking resolution. The investigation would continue despite the passage of time, with the hope that new information could eventually reveal the truth behind Danielle's death and identify the person responsible for the crime that had taken her life. The family and investigators continued seeking answers while waiting for long-awaited justice. For nearly 28 years, the question of who took Danielle Hinn's life remained unanswered. After the investigation became a cold case, the sheriff's office continued pursuing the possibility that new information could emerge and provide answers in Danielle's death. The passage of time did not end the search for justice, as investigators continued looking for opportunities to revisit the evidence and identify the person responsible. In 2019, the investigation was reopened as authorities hoped advances in forensic science could offer new possibilities. The decision represented a renewed effort to examine preserved evidence from Danielle's case and bring answers to a mystery that had remained unresolved for decades. Investigators returned to the available evidence with the goal of using modern methods to uncover information that had not previously been available. The preserved evidence was sent to a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory in California, where it underwent careful analysis. Investigators examined the DNA evidence and compared the profile against the FBI's CODIS database, hoping it would produce a match that could identify a person connected to the crime. However, the CODIS comparison did not result in a match. Although the outcome was disappointing, investigators did not stop their efforts. They continued searching for another method that could help identify the individual connected to the evidence. Their persistence in pursuing new investigative tools kept Danielle's case active and moved the search closer toward a possible breakthrough. Investigation remained focused on finding answers, as law enforcement continued exploring every available path to solve Danielle's case. After the DNA evidence did not produce a match through CODIS, investigators turned to genetic genealogy as a new approach in the search for answers in Danielle Hinn's case. With a court order, they accessed extensive DNA databases, hoping to find a connection that traditional methods had not revealed. This process created a new opportunity to examine the evidence and potentially identify the person connected to Danielle's death. The genetic genealogy approach resulted in a DNA match that led investigators to Paul Hutchinson, a five-year-old man living in Dillon, Montana. The discovery marked the breakthrough investigators had been searching for after decades without an identified suspect. It provided a significant development in a case that had remained unresolved for nearly 28 years. In July 2024, investigators went to Hutchinson's home and approached him about Danielle's case. During the interaction, Investigators observed behavior they described as tense, nervous, and erratic. The encounter became part of the investigation, as this is examining the information connected to the case without adding conclusions beyond what was observed. Just hours after the interview, on the 9th of August 2024, Houchinson took his own life, ending the possibility of a full confession from him. Although his death meant he would not provide a confession or face trial, investigators continued examining the evidence. The breakthrough was not considered complete until forensic analysts confirmed that the DNA evidence from Danielle's case matched Houchinson. This confirmation established the long-awaited connection between Houchinson and the evidence from Danielle's case. Investigators had finally confirmed the DNA result after years of searching for answers. The confirmation brought the investigation closer to resolution, while still leaving the unanswered questions surrounding the case and the absence of a trial. The evidence provided the final step needed to identify Houchinson as the person connected to Danielle's death. For nearly 28 years of uncertainty, investigators finally received confirmation that the DNA evidence from Danielle Hinn's case was an undeniable match to Paul Houchinson. After decades of questions, the person connected to Danielle's death had been identified through forensic analysis. The confirmation marked a significant moment in the investigation, providing answers after a long search for the truth. The resolution brought mixed emotions for Danielle's family. While the identification of Houchinson provided a sense of closure, it also came with sorrow because he died before facing a jury or answering questions in court. Danielle's younger sister, Stephanie Mollet, stated that she had no doubt Houchinson was responsible for the violent assault against her sister. Her words reflected the family's long wait for justice and the pain caused by the years without answers. Stephanie's statement explained that 28 years was far too long for the family to wait, and that she had fought for justice for her five-year-old sister, Danielle. She also shared that Danielle's story should make people think about the mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters in their lives, and consider what they would do to protect and honor the women they love. The case resolution finally brought answers that Danielle's family had waited for after nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. However, the confirmation did not erase the loss or the pain that remained after years of waiting for justice. The discovery provided clarity about the person connected to Danielle's death, but the emotional impact of the tragedy continued for those who loved her. The family could finally understand the outcome of the investigation, while still carrying the grief created by Danielle's loss. The case resolution represented a long-awaited answer after decades of searching, but it also showed the lasting effects of the crime and the years spent waiting. Following the identification of Paul Houchinson, attention turned to the aftermath of the investigation and the people affected by the revelation. Houchinson was married, worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 22 years, had 2 children, including a daughter around the age of 20 and a younger son. He was also a graduate student at Montana State and had only been in the area for a short period at the time Danielle was killed. Houchinson's wife, Chrissy, expressed heartbreak after learning the news and offered sympathy to Danielle Hinn's family. She explained that their family was already grieving Houchinson's death and that this discovery made their grief more complicated. Chrissy stated that during their 4-year marriage, there had never been any indication that something like this could have been happening. Following the DNA confirmation, the investigation into Danielle's case is closed. However, law enforcement continues examining Houchinson's life and possible connections to other cold cases. Danielle's story remains a reminder of the lasting impact of her case and the answers finally provided to her family after decades of uncertainty. Investigators continue efforts to understand whether Houchinson may have been connected to other unresolved investigations as they examine the evidence. In October 1987, a discovery behind a business on the 5400 block of La Sierra Avenue in Riverside, California, began an investigation that would remain unresolved for more than 3 decades. A man searching through a dumpster for recyclable materials found the lifeless body of a newborn baby girl hidden among the trash. The discovery was immediately reported, bringing authorities into a case centered on an unidentified infant whose identity and circumstances surrounding her death were unknown. The Riverside County Coroner's Office conducted a thorough examination of the newborn and determined that the baby's life had been taken. Following the examination, the Riverside Police Department began investigating the circumstances surrounding the infant's death. Detectives worked to understand what had happened and attempted to uncover information that could identify the baby or anyone connected to the crime. At the time, the newborn remained unidentified, and the details surrounding her life before the discovery were unclear. The investigation focused on the facts available: a newborn baby girl found deceased, a location connected to the discovery, and a search for answers that began in 1987. Authorities worked to gather information and pursue leads, but the case would eventually become unresolved as the years passed. The circumstances surrounding the baby's birth and the events before her discovery remained unknown. The case began with a tragic finding, an unidentified victim, and an investigation that would continue for decades as investigators sought to determine what happened and who was responsible. Search for answers would later continue through renewed investigative efforts, but the initial case remained unsolved. After the discovery of the newborn baby girl, detectives with the Riverside Police Department began investigating the circumstances surrounding the crime. Investigators followed available leads, interviewed potential witnesses, and searched for evidence connected to the infant's death. Despite these efforts, authorities were unable to identify the baby's mother or determine who was responsible for taking the newborn's life. The investigation continued as detectives worked to uncover information that could explain what had happened. However, the lack of information about the baby's identity and the person or people involved prevented authorities from reaching a conclusion. As time passed, the case remained unresolved and eventually became a cold case, meaning the crime remained unsolved despite the investigative efforts that had already taken place. Many questions remained unanswered, including the identity of the baby's mother. The pregnancy itself was described as a momentous event that should have been marked by joy, but the circumstances surrounding it remained unclear. It was unknown whether the pregnancy resulted from a relationship or whether other factors were involved. These unanswered questions added to the uncertainty surrounding the case and the search for answers. The investigation did not provide information about what occurred during the pregnancy or before the discovery. Instead, authorities were left with the known facts. A deceased newborn baby girl was found, and investigators had attempted to identify those connected to her death. The case remained inactive for many years as unanswered questions continued to surround the circumstances of the crime. The unresolved investigation reflected the difficulty of finding answers without the missing information needed. In 2020, the Riverside Police Department's Cold Case Unit made the decision to revisit the investigation into the unidentified newborn baby girl, whose case had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades. Detectives renewed their efforts to identify the infant and determine who was connected to the crime. The renewed investigation brought together the Riverside Police Department's Cold Case Unit, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Team, and the nonprofit organization Season of Justice. This collaboration focused on using new forensic technology, particularly advanced DNA analysis, in hopes of identifying the mother of the deceased infant. After years without a resolution, the case moved from an unsolved investigation into a renewed search for answers. Investigators continued working toward identifying the baby and bringing progress to a case that had remained open for over 30 years. Modern forensic methods provided a new opportunity to examine evidence that had remained unresolved and offered a path toward identifying the person connected to the case. The focus remained on the partnership between law enforcement and Season of Justice, as authorities sought answers through advanced DNA analysis. The technology became a key step toward identifying the baby's mother after decades of uncertainty. Investigators were driven by the goal of resolving questions surrounding the unidentified infant and uncovering information that had remained unknown for many years. The renewed efforts represented a significant development in a case that had remained unsolved since 1987. While avoiding speculation about events not established by investigators, the collaboration centered only on the available facts and the continued search for long-awaited answers. In 2020, investigators reached a major breakthrough in the renewed investigation into the unidentified newborn baby girl. After years of uncertainty, DNA evidence was used to help identify the mother of the deceased infant as Melissa Jean Allen Avila. For the first time since the discovery in 1987, authorities had a name connected to the case. The identification of Avila represented a significant development after the investigation had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades. However, discovering her identity did not immediately bring the case to an end. Authorities still needed to locate Avila and continue the legal process connected to the crime. The breakthrough came after forensic advances provided investigators with new information that had not been available during the original investigation. DNA analysis became the key step that allowed authorities to identify the baby's mother after years of unanswered questions. The case moved forward as investigators continued pursuing the information needed to address the unresolved crime. This development focused only on the role of DNA evidence and the identification made through the renewed investigation. No details were provided about Avila's personal life, motivations, or circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. The facts established were that DNA evidence produced a name and that authorities identified Melissa Jean Allen Avila as the mother of the deceased infant. After more than 30 years, the investigation had reached a new stage as authorities continued working toward the next steps in the legal process. The investigation continued as authorities worked to move the case forward while relying on the evidence obtained through the advanced analysis. After investigators identified Melissa Jean Allen Avila through DNA evidence, authorities began the effort to locate her. The investigation had established her identity, but the case could not move forward until she was found. Avila had moved across the country after the events of 1987, creating the need for authorities to continue searching for her location. The search came to an end on the 7th of August, 2024, when Avila was apprehended. At the time of her arrest, she was a 5-year-old resident of Shelby, North Carolina. Her apprehension was the result of coordinated efforts between the U.S. Marshals Pacific Southwest Regional Fugitive Task Force and the U.S. Marshals Carolinas Regional Fugitive Task Force. Following her arrest, Avila was extradited back to Riverside County, California, the location connected to the events of 1987. Her return marked another major step in a case that had remained unresolved for decades before an arrest was made. The focus of this stage of the investigation remained on the timeline established by authorities: identification through DNA evidence, the search for Avila, her arrest, and her extradition back to Riverside County. The investigation moved into the legal system after more than 30 years without an arrest. No additional details about the arrest process or Avila's actions before, during, or after the crime were provided. The known facts centered on authorities locating the identified person connected to the case and continuing the legal process after the long unresolved investigation. This development represented the continuation of efforts to address the case through the information obtained during the renewed investigation process. After being extradited to Riverside County, Melissa Jean Allen Avila faced charges connected to the death of her newborn baby girl. She was booked into the Larry D. Smith Correctional Facility, marking a major change from the years she had spent outside the reach of investigators. Bail was set at $1.1 million, reflecting the seriousness of the charges against her. The court would hear the evidence connecting Avila to the killing, with DNA analysis expected to play a central role in the prosecution's case. The investigation began with the discovery of the newborn in 1987, followed by decades of uncertainty before advanced DNA analysis provided new information that helped authorities identify the person connected to the crime. The case remained unresolved for more than 30 years before forensic technology helped move the investigation forward. Following the arrest in 2024, the case entered the legal process as authorities continued pursuing the evidence connected to the charges against Avila. DNA analysis remained a key part of the prosecution's efforts as the court prepared to hear the evidence. The case journeyed from the discovery of the newborn baby girl through years of unanswered questions to the use of advanced DNA analysis and the arrest of Avila after more than 3 decades. The investigation reached a new stage while awaiting the legal proceedings that would determine the next developments in the case. The final stage of the investigation focused on presenting evidence in court, while DNA analysis continued to remain central throughout proceedings. On the 29th of April, 1999, a discovery in a wooded area along Avon Avenue near Hartford Avenue began the criminal investigation into the disappearance of Melissa Patton. Inside a garbage bag discarded in a dumpster, investigators found the severed and bleached head of a woman. The discovery marked the beginning of an investigation that would later identify the remains as belonging to Melissa. On the 3rd of June, 1999, additional dismembered remains belonging to the same woman were found in black trash bags discarded in another dumpster. The torso was still missing. Investigators examined the condition of the remains and determined that the dismemberment appeared to have been carried out with a saw. The method suggested a deliberate and methodical attempt to dispose of the body. The locations where the remains were discovered became significant because they were located close to a glass company where Melissa's husband, Christopher Wolfenbarger, had worked during the late 1990s. This connection became an important part of the early investigation as authorities examined the circumstances surrounding Melissa's death. Investigators also considered Christopher's history with the company. He had been dismissed after being suspected of stealing a reciprocating saw, a tool investigators believe could have been used in the dismemberment. The evidence created a focus on Christopher while investigators continued examining the facts of the case. At this stage, Authorities had not reached any final conclusions and continued reviewing the available information carefully while seeking to understand the events that led to the discovery of Melissa's remains and crime. Melissa Patton was born on the 9th of September 1977 to Carl and Norma Patton. She grew up just outside Atlanta, Georgia, where she shared a close bond with her older sister Tina. Those who knew Melissa remembered her as someone with an infectious personality. She was often described by her loved ones as bubbly, kind, and trusting, qualities that shaped how her family viewed her. After high school, Melissa married her longtime boyfriend, Christopher Wolfenbarger. The couple relocated to another part of Atlanta, where they began their life together. Their marriage included 2 children, a son named Joey and a daughter named Chrissy. Melissa embraced her role as a wife and mother with joy and dedication, focusing on her family and the life they had built together. The last known contact Melissa's parents had with her occurred on Thanksgiving Day in 1998. During a phone call from Christopher's grandparents' home, Melissa spoke with her family and discussed plans for Christmas. The conversation gave her parents the impression that everything was normal. That sense of normalcy changed when Melissa failed to appear during the holiday season and later missed her mother's birthday in February 1999. Concerned by her absence, Norma Patton decided to travel to Melissa's home to find out what had happened. When she arrived, neighbors provided disturbing information. They explained that Christopher and Melissa had mysteriously moved away shortly after Christmas, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. The unexpected disappearance raised questions for Melissa's family and marked the beginning of their search for answers. Her family continued seeking answers afterward. Christopher Wolfenbarger became the central focus of suspicion following Melissa Patton's disappearance because of several circumstances surrounding her absence. Christopher never filed a missing person report for Melissa and did not inform her family that she was gone. His lack of communication became a major concern for Melissa's loved ones, especially because he had a documented history of domestic violence against her. Christopher's silence increased the fears of the Patton family. Norma Patton's discovery that Christopher and Melissa had moved away shortly after Christmas without explanation created additional questions. The absence of information about their whereabouts, combined with Christopher's failure to seek help or contact Melissa's family, left relatives searching for answers about what had happened to her. As investigators examined the circumstances, they considered Christopher's history and connections to the case. The locations where Melissa's remains were discovered were close to the glass company where Christopher had worked during the late 1990s. Investigators viewed this connection as significant. The fact that Christopher had been dismissed from the company after being suspected of stealing a reciprocating saw became another detail examined during the investigation because a saw appeared to have been used in the dismemberment of Melissa's body. Although suspicion developed around Christopher, investigators had not yet gathered enough concrete evidence to formally charge him. The careful dismemberment and bleaching of the head indicated a perpetrator who had access to the necessary tools and knowledge. However, identifying the remains and building a complete case against Christopher would require years of investigation before authorities could move forward. Investigation continued as authorities worked to uncover additional evidence surrounding Melissa's disappearance and death. In 2003, a major breakthrough emerged in the investigation into Melissa Patton's disappearance when authorities successfully identified the dismembered remains as hers through advanced DNA testing. The identification was made possible through a DNA sample from Melissa's father, Carl Patton, who had recently been arrested for a series of unrelated crimes. For Melissa's family, the DNA results provided confirmation of what had happened to her after years of uncertainty. However, the investigation also uncovered a disturbing part of Carl's own history. Between 1973 and 1977, Carl was responsible for the killings of 5 individuals across Georgia, including 3 victims connected to the infamous Flint River slayings. Those cases had remained unsolved for years until DNA evidence linked Carl to them. As authorities continued their investigation, Carl pleaded guilty to 4 of the cases in March 2003 and the 5th case in May 2003. His confessions resulted in a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The discovery of Carl's crimes initially led investigators to consider whether he could have been involved in Melissa's disappearance and murder. However, further scrutiny established that Carl had been incarcerated well before Melissa vanished, eliminating him as a suspect in her case. While this development cleared Carl of involvement in Melissa's death, it brought a new source of anguish for the Patton family. Melissa's remains had been identified, but the person responsible for her disappearance and killing remained unidentified. Investigators continued searching for answers as the case remained unresolved, and the focus eventually returned to the unanswered questions surrounding Christopher Wolfenbarger and Melissa's final days before authorities could identify the person believed responsible later. In 2024, investigators reopened the examination of Melissa Patton's case after Carl Patton had been eliminated as a suspect. Attention returned to Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's estranged husband, who had remained the primary focus of suspicion since the early stages of the investigation. Law enforcement reviewed the evidence again, using fresh investigative methods and new forensic techniques. These developments eventually pointed toward Christopher as the prime suspect in Melissa's killing. Although concerns about Christopher had existed for years, authorities had previously struggled to gather enough concrete evidence to bring formal charges against him. The renewed investigation marked a significant change in the case. After decades without an arrest, investigators were able to move forward based on the information and evidence gathered through their updated examination. Christopher was arrested in August 2024 at his home in Griffin, Georgia. During the arrest, officers found him attempting to evade capture by hiding behind a dryer inside the residence. His arrest became a major moment in the long effort to seek justice for Melissa. On the 6th of August 2024, Christopher was formally charged with taking Melissa's life. At a press conference, Detective Shepard, who had taken over the case several years earlier, explained that Christopher had been considered a person of interest from the beginning, and that probable cause allowed authorities to make the arrest. When asked about the evidence connecting Christopher to the crime, Detective Shepard declined to provide specific details. He stated that protecting the integrity of the case moving forward was important as the legal process continued. The arrest brought a significant development in the investigation, while authorities continued working to present the case and preserve the details surrounding Melissa's death for court. After Christopher Wolfenbarger's arrest, Melissa Patton's family experienced a bittersweet sense of vindication. The man they had long suspected was finally in custody, but the development also forced them to revisit the trauma of losing Melissa and the years of uncertainty surrounding her death. Norma Patton said the family had finally reached the moment where Christopher was in custody, but there was still one final hurdle: securing a conviction. She expressed that Christopher was the only person who truly knew what happened to Melissa. The unanswered questions about why he committed the crime remained a source of pain for the family. Norma also shared the final words she had for her daughter Melissa. She said she loved her and that Melissa knew where she was if she ever needed her. Melissa's sister Tina stated that the family believed Christopher was responsible from the beginning. She said there was never any doubt in their minds about who had done this. Tina also expressed that Melissa did not deserve what happened to her. The family's message extended to others experiencing domestic violence. Tina hoped that anyone in a similar situation would leave and seek safety. Their words reflected their desire to prevent others from experiencing the suffering Melissa endured and find protection.